It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. We're at show number 314, late summer in 2019. Last night we had our first chilly night, sign of things to come. We will go here in the Chicagoland, Illinois area part of the country. We're going to go from bitching about the heat in a few weeks to bitching about the cold. That's just kind of how it works in a lot of places, actually. But, that's just the way the world works. Got a lot of stuff coming up today. And again, my apologies that I just can't seem to get out shows in 7 days at a time. Hopefully you can survive that and live through that. And know that if you contribute at Patreon, patreon.com/Phil, if you become a patron, you're paying less than for other shows because you only pay per show. So you can go contribute $1 or much, much more. I don't think there's an upper limit. I'm sure there must be one somewhere. But if you like the show and you appreciate the valuable information contained in it, and or if you just appreciate the effort that I do to make the show, go throw in a couple of bucks there. It is a nice sign for me to see a little bit of love coming from the listeners. Later in the show, we are going to have a nice interview with Matt Dillahunty, where we're going to talk about the Bible and slavery and the Atheist Experience TV show, Atheist Community of Austin, and a whole bunch of other fun things. I think you're really going to enjoy that. We're also going to talk about, oh my God, I forgot already. What do we have in the show? Oh, yes. We're going to continue with our series of asset allocation. This is asset allocation part 2, bonds. And another little segment, 2 segments today. It's going to be a long show, so hopefully you like long shows. We're going to have a nice segment on investment clarity and what I mean when I drop that word or phrase, I guess, into the show. What is investment clarity? A couple short things that I also want to throw into the show. Vanguard, over the last couple of weeks, has been sending out a letter that talks about your possible investment going from paying out cash and dividends, from going to pay to firm to paying to you at the address on record. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's cool. It doesn't apply to you. But if you have an account at Vanguard, this might happen. But if you have an account at TD Ameritrade with Vanguard funds, I know for a fact this is happening because I've had about 20 people contact me. And this has been generated by Vanguard, and they have said in error because of the change from investor share class to admiral share class with a lot of the funds. So nothing has changed. Everything is fine. No action is needed on your part. And I have been told that Vanguard is working on a letter that they're going to send to all the people they sent this confusing little form to explain what they did and why. So everything is cool. Don't sweat it. Another quick and short topic I'm going to do, just a brief mention on HSAs, health savings accounts. I've had a few emails asking some of my thoughts on these, and I have discussed them at length. It's probably been a year or 2 or 3 or 4 ago. I think I've done it twice, so you could research that. But the short thing I wanted to discuss is they were talking about, should I max out my HSA, and should I max out my HSA before I max out my 401k so I can have all this money for medical purposes, because you can pull the money out kind of sort of anytime you want, unlike a 401k. Keep in mind, of course, that my ideas on this are subject to change, and your case may be different, and this suggestion doesn't apply to you at all. But I usually look at the HSA as a place to store possibly a few $1,000s extra, 3, 5, because if you do have a big medical bill that you, of course, weren't expecting, and it's $5,000, you can pull the money out and pay that medical bill. But I do not like the idea of packing in the maximum amount that you can every year and not spending it and building up $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in your HSA. The reason for that is HSA expense ratios are generally higher. There's often documentation fees, transfer fees, fund fees, all kinds of different fees, and that's driven mostly by the fact that most HSA accounts will never get very big. I see on a regular basis people with IRAs that have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of dollars. An HSA health savings account, that probably is not going to happen. The most you can put in is something around $5,000 or $6,000, and most people spend the bulk of that in a given year on medical expenses. That's the primary purpose for the account. So the custodian, someone like Fidelity or Vanguard or Schwab, who owns this account or holds this account in your name, they know there's regularly small amounts of money coming in, and there's regularly small amounts of money going out to pay medical bills. That makes it expensive to run those investments. They have to cover that cost somewhere, and you are the most likely person to pay for it because they're not going to pay for it. So an HSA can have very limited choices, very high expenses, and if you're putting money in and money out, it's hard to know exactly what you have, and it's hard for them to keep the costs down. So it is something that I would think of as kind of a last place to put money. So after you filled it up with 3 to 5, or if you want to get crazy, 10,000 for medical expenses, don't put more in than you expect to pay in the following year because of the high expenses. There's other places you can do this. And I've also had people, when they leave their job and they want to move their HSA to somewhere else, you have very limited options. So just something to keep in mind. It's not a bad idea to put some money there. But don't get nutty unless you run out of other choices. Other choices, IRAs, Roth IRAs. If you're married, you can put money in your spouse's IRA or Roth IRA. If you qualify for all the other rules, you can put money in your 401k. If you have a spouse, you can put money in his or her 401k. You can even put money in a taxable account. And something that I often suggest is if you're a few years from retirement and you have a ton of money in IRAs and very little money that's available easily without conditions and penalties, you could put some money in a taxable account and maybe actually pay less taxes in the next few years than if it was in the IRA. It's another topic that we've talked about before. So that we have that. And then I have someone sent me an email wondering if you might devote a show to how one might advise parents that are in their 80s on their investment strategies as they grow older and prepare for an inheritance transfer. So I have a couple things that pop in mind specific to this. One is that the investment philosophy may not change at all. They can invest the same way that they've been investing. If they follow my strategies with the cushion would remain. One thing they can do, if they wish to, is they probably could pull out a higher percentage of the portfolio. You don't have to limit to the ultra-conservative 4% or the reasonable 5% or the slightly aggressive to considerably aggressive 6%. You might go to 7 or 8% because think about this. If you're making, if you're 85, and let's say you take out 10% a year in your portfolio. If you're 85 and you take out 10% a year and your portfolio makes no money, you're going to run out of your portfolio in 10 years at the age of 95. What are the odds you're going to live to 95? Well, if you're 85, they're not unreasonable, but it could happen. But most people don't live to 95. But your portfolio hopefully does something better than zero. So if you're taking out 10%, it will last longer than 10 years. If you're making 5 or 6%, it could last 15, 18 years. That, of course, is contrary to the question I was just asked, because that would rip through the portfolio. So keep taking out the 5% if you are still comfortable with just 5% of the money. Don't change the strategy unless you have a whole bunch more money. If you see that you only need 2 or 3% out of the portfolio because your investments have done very well, you can set aside part of that money knowing that it's going to your kids, grandkids, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles, wherever it's going to go, charities, and you can put more of it in the stock market. I don't know if today is the best time to do that, but as a long-term strategy, one could do that. The other thing you could do, of course, is if you think that you're going to be handing this money over in a few years because you're going to pass away, you could start giving some of the money away right now through gifting rules through the IRS. And I don't know exactly what that number is off the top of my head, but something you should check with your tax professional, do a little Googling on. If it's a husband and wife team or a wife, husband team, you can each give up to a certain limit to any person that you want. So if you have several kids, each of you, both of you, could give a considerable amount of money to each one of the people you want to give money to, and you can give away a lot of money in a very short period of time over a few years. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing, of course, is maybe you want to have a trust. And it's a weird thing because I've actually talked to some attorneys that are less likely to recommend a trust than I am, even though they could get paid to make a trust, which kind of surprised me when an attorney doesn't want to take your money. My kind of guideline is if you have more than $500,000 in assets, you might want to trust. And it depends. I mean, if you have one IRA and you list your 3 kids on it, when you pass away, it's just you, no spouse, just you and your 3 kids. It's easy. You don't need a trust. Absolutely. Even if the IRA is $1.2 million, you don't need a trust. But if you have property or a house, you might want to have a trust. If you have some desires or goals of what to do with this money that are a little more complicated, a trust is a really good idea because the will can say this person gets this person gets this, and you can do a little bit more control and manipulation from a will, but you can do much more from a trust. And again, keep this with a grain of salt because I am not an attorney, and I've just made statements that might sound like I know what I'm talking about with the law. Check with your own personal counsel. But with the trust, I know for a fact you can say half of the money goes to this person, 25% to this person, 25% to this person, and they get 10% of it 6 months after I die. They get 10% a year later, year after year after year, and you can drag it out for a long period of time. If someone you are giving money to, you think maybe won't be the best at managing their own assets, you can control from the grave. I'm pretty sure that varies by state. So again, seek out legal counsel. I do know that in my case, my parents had made a trust many years ago, and it did make things a lot easier. I also had the fortune that my mom had moved to a senior apartment. So the house had been sold. She sold the car to me because she wasn't going to drive anymore. And everything else was in the trust. So my dad, who had passed 5 years before my mom, then when my mom passed, it became very easy for me to be the trustee and comply with all the rules and regulations of the trust and distribute the money as was intended because of that document network that was done in advance. So there's some thoughts about that. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to do some actual more Investing Skeptically segments. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk to Matt Dillahunty. So don't go anywhere. This is part 2 of our asset allocation, little special mini-series, I guess I'm going to call it, asset allocation. And today I'm going to talk about bonds specifically just for a few minutes. Previously, I talked about how much goes in bonds and stocks and international, and you can listen to that in the previous show, and that was show number 313. So today, bonds, what I'm going to talk about are the specific bond funds that I like today. This is late summer of 2019, and if you're listening to this a few months or a few years from now, my preferences may change. It also may be something that one or more of these funds are not a good choice for you for some reason, or maybe there's something that's better. This is not a specific recommendation to any of you listeners. It's just ideas. It's education. Maybe the show sometimes is entertaining, but hopefully, generally, it's educational. So I'm going to give specific symbol names for some of these funds, which is a 5-letter string. That's it. 5-letter string. It's a 5-letter string of letters I was going to say, but I'm not going to say that. It's 5-letter string. And you can look that up and see the information yourself. And I'm just going to start right off here with VBIRX. VBIRX. That is the Vanguard Short-Term Government Bond Fund Admiral Share, if you can qualify for it. And a lot of the Admiral Share funds have dropped to a minimum of 3,000, but a few of the bond ones still have higher numbers. So if you don't qualify for it on the Vanguard site, you can just look for the investor share version of any one of these funds. And this fund is, and I'm going to do these in order of risk. So this is the safest. This is barely riskier, I guess, barely riskier than cash. It's going to make you a little bit more than cash. Cash, like a CD or something, might make 1.5, 2. The current yield on this, as of the time I pulled up the data in the last few weeks, so it might be a teeny bit off from this, is about 2%. So 2% is not a lot of money, but unless Trump fucks up all of the government, you're going to get it. You're going to make 2%. It's kind of like a given. It's a sure thing. It's the surest thing you're going to get. I guess that's what you're going to. And so that's why it's only 2%. You're not going to make much. Interest rates are currently incredibly low. Now, the amazing thing is that this fund in the last 12 months, and this data is as of June 30th of 2019, because as I'd mentioned previously, I don't want to look up daily data because it's going to change every freaking day. So just don't worry about it, what it is on any specific day. But the return over the last 12 months ending June 30th is 5.22%. And one of the things a lot of people don't understand is if you buy a bond portfolio and it has a yield of 2% like this fund does, what you should expect in the long run, over 3 to 5 years, and it gets a little harder with short-term bond funds because they're going to fluctuate a little bit more as they replace bonds with new bonds. But if the yield is 2%, you should expect to make no more than 2%. Because the only way you make money in a bond in the long run is the dividend. That's it. That's it. Now, of course, there's an infinite number of variations and exceptions to this rule, but particularly with this fund, when you're buying very short-term U.S. government bonds that are paying 2% yield, you are going to get 2% and no more. As an example, the 10-year return on this fund is 2.13% per year, about what I would expect during a period of incredibly low interest rates. So how did it make 5.2% in the last 12 months? Because some people are getting a little skittish and more people have bought these types of bonds, driving up the price in the short run, which does mean there is a possibility it will underperform in the future. Will that be next year? Will it not be next year? A fund like this, because it's bonds, could lose money. It might pay 2% dividend, but go down 3 or 4% in price, which would give you a net return of -1 or -2. So there is that possibility. And in that case, cash or money market or a CD would have been better. So this is a little more risky, but we're talking a little teeny bit more, but you could make more money. Not much more money, 2%. The next one I have is VFSUX. VFSUX. That's also short term, but it's corporate bonds. So like the previous fund, these are 1, 2, maybe 3-year bonds. So they're going to come due pretty soon. And in this case, of course, a corporate bond has a slightly higher risk than the U.S. government bonds. Some of the companies might not be able to pay the bills. Some might not be able to pay a dividend, or they skip a dividend payment, or they default on the bond completely and go into bankruptcy. If that happens, there's certain order of things that get paid out with the bankruptcy court. It might be taxes, employee wages, the bonds, and then if you own stocks in that company, you're last in line and likely to lose more money than everybody else. But as a bondholder, you're likely to get bulk of your money back, but you're not necessarily going to get all of it, and you might lose the dividends for a while everything gets settled out. Thankfully, generally, especially with short-term bonds, that doesn't happen very often. But this is where knowing the bond or the mutual fund bond rating score is important. And the most highest for usually reserved for U.S. government bonds is AAA. So AAA is great. And then below that is AA, and then A, and then BBB, BB, which now BB and below is generally considered junk or, I guess just junk. We'll call it junk, non-investment grade. So when you get a corporate bond fund like this one, you want to understand what its other risk profile is, the quality of the bonds, because in this fund, it's going to pay out about 2.5% yield, 2.5% dividend at the most, because some of those companies, probably 2 or 3%, won't pay all the money all the time. So you'll get something a little bit less than that. And if I look at the 10-year performance on this, it's made about 3%, and the current yield is 2.5%. And that's what you should expect in the long run from a fund like this, because the bonds are going to pay the yield minus a little bit of default or a lack of payment or underpayment. So it is a little more risky than the short-term government bond fund, can pay a little bit more money. And sometimes they move a little bit differently, but these are very common funds. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over a whole nother 2 categories of funds that I currently do not use. I'm just going to mention. You can research them yourself if you wish. That's intermediate and long-term U.S. government bonds. And of course, you can get government or corporate in both of those categories. And the reason I'm not doing that is because interest rates are at historic record lows. And if interest rates go up, which I guess it doesn't look like that's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe even a year or two until we get rid of the Donald. But when interest rates go up, these funds can get whacked pretty hard. And I'm going to give you an example of one of them that I'm worried about. The Vanguard Long-Term Corporate Fund. And again, this is something I am not recommending you buy, but I'm just wanted to bring up the topic. VLTCX, Vanguard Long-Term Corporate Bond Fund, VLTCX. Current yield is about 4%. So you can see the 4% versus the 2 and 2.5, obviously about 1.5 to 2% more. The long-term return on this over 10 years has been 8.5%. And remember, I said 4% minus a little bit of default, but that's because long-term bonds haven't always been 4. They used to be a lot more. They used to pay 6, 7, 8, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And what short-term bonds paid 20 years ago doesn't really matter because a short-term bond fund only has bonds that are 3 to 5 years old. So what was going on 10 years ago doesn't matter. But when you look at long-term bond funds, this fund may still have bonds in it from 10 years ago. Matter of fact, it probably does because the long-term bond funds will often have a duration of 15 to 20 years. And if you get a very specific type of longer-term bond fund, there are even bonds out there that are 30 years or more. So one of the added benefits and or risks of a long-term bond fund is short-term volatility. In the case of this bond fund, in the last 12 months, again, ending June 30th, it made 14%. And yes, I've been recommending not to own it. And yes, in the short term, I look pretty fucking stupid because it made 14%. But if at some point from this position of record low interest rates, they go up 1 or 2%, let's say 2%, a fund with a 20-year duration, if the market goes up, or if interest rates go up 2%, you could lose 40%. And the purpose of owning most of these bonds is to have the cushion to have something relatively safe in case the stock market goes down. Long-term bonds and intermediate-term bonds are things that I have used in the past when interest rates were more normal or high, particularly if interest rates get high. And that's why the long-term performance on this bond fund is so amazing, because around 2000, bond interest rates were really high. We're talking long-term bonds, 6, 7, maybe even 8%. And so as those interest rates fell farther and farther and farther to where they are now, about 4%, every time they go down a point, you can make 5, 10, 15%, which is why the long-term return is so good. So this is something that if you bought it 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, you've done very well. If you buy it today, my expectation is about 4%, because that's the yield, minus any defaults or short payments that you have, plus you add the volatility of how U.S. interest rates might affect the price to the negative, or in this case, for the last 12 months, to the positive, which would have been great if we had bought it a year ago. But we didn't know that someone was going to fuck around with trade war and tariffs and screw everything up and put the economy at risk, so that the Fed is now reversing course and has lowered interest rates. Now, the Fed only has kind of sort of control on really, really, really short, almost like daily, overnight rates. But when the entire market or the entire world gets concerned that things are more volatile and unsteady, people rush in and buy bonds. And that's what causes the interest rate on long-term bonds to go down, because if you're selling bonds, if you can get 3% from new investors because everybody wants them, you don't have to pay 4%. And particularly with U.S. government long-term bonds, their current yield is 2.5%. So that's the whole yield inversion thing. That you can get a 20-year bond that's paying 2.5, or you can get a 3-year bond paying 2.5. Why would you get the 20-year bond? But somebody's buying it. That's why the interest rate went down, because those are auctioned off. Anyway, enough about that. Another thing you can do if you don't have a whole lot of money is get the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index. That is VBTLX. And just keep in mind that has all the conservative stuff, that has short-term, long-term. It has everything in there. Its current yield is 2.6 because everything is paying about that or less. A couple things paying more. I don't love it because it does include the intermediate and the long-term bonds, but they're in smaller percentages. So it's a pretty safe, reasonable place to go if you can only afford one bond fund. Another fund that I like is the Jenny May Fund from Vanguard. That is VFIJX. And that is based on home mortgages and people paying back their home mortgages. They are slightly different response to interest rate fluctuations, because when interest rates go down, people can and do refinance their homes sometimes. As interest rates go up, a lot of times they don't, And so these bonds won't change as much with interest rates fluctuations. So there's a way to make a little bit more yield. Right now, about 2.93%. But you have to keep in mind, if you buy a Ginnie Mae fund, a fund that buys Ginnie Mae's, or if you buy individual Ginnie Mae's, which you can do, and I strongly recommend you do not do that. But Ginnie Mae's pay back dividend and principal. Just like when you make a mortgage payment, you're making a principal reduction and you're paying the interest due for that month. People in the past have been, and people in the future, I guess, will be confused by this. So the payback might be 7%, where the yield is only 3%. So you're getting 3% interest and you're getting 4% of your principal back. So if you have a $100,000 investment, you make $3,000 in dividends, $4,000 in principal repayment. Now your investment is worth $96,000. If that's what you want, if that's what you understand and that's what you intend, there's nothing wrong with that. But where people get destroyed is when their portfolio shrinks in size by 4% every year, and they take that 7% that they've been given as cash and they spend it. And they do that year after year after year after year for 8-10 years. And now they have a problem because their Ginnie Mae holdings are not 100,000, they're 50,000. And now, of course, if you're getting paid 7% out of that, you're getting 3,500, but you need 7,000. So just something to keep an eye on. Then the last three I have here are meant to be in much smaller proportions. The other ones can be the bulk, 60, 70, 80, probably 80, 85% of your total portfolio should be in the short-term government, short-term corporate, Ginnie Mae, and or total bond fund. These last three, probably no more than 5% of your total portfolio in any one of these three, and definitely no more than 10% of your bond positions. So kind of keep those guides in mind. And I'm just going to go over them briefly here. The first one is total international bonds, VTABX. And in part because while the yield is 0.5%, there are actually countries around the world right now that are paying negative interest rates on their bonds. A topic for another show, but they're very safe. You're going to get next to nothing, but you're going to get your money back, and they will respond differently than the U.S. bonds from time to time. Sometimes it's going to be the exact same thing, and so it didn't matter that you had it, but sometimes it may go up or go down when U.S. bonds do something differently. So if you're in retirement, you have some options of where you can pick and choose from, and it gives you this investment clarity because each fund is very specific. The next one is emerging market bonds, very much like the fund I just mentioned, except for it is buying bonds in countries that are emerging, and that means Qatar, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, not Brazil, Chile, Indonesia, things like that. So again, a little bit more risk. It behaves different than the other bonds sometimes. And the last one would go back to the United States is the high yield or junk bond fund. That's I'm going to start that over. That's VWEAX. Vanguard High Yield, also known as junk, VWEAX. It has made about 9% in the last 12 months, and its long-term annual return is just shy of 7%, and that's all the way back to 1978. That's a very old fund. All the way back to 1978. In the last 10 years, it's averaged 8.5%. So that is a fund that I would expect to pay about 5% because that's the yield. It can make considerably more. It can make considerably less. But if all the other bonds, you have a time period where they make 1 or 2 or 3%, and this one makes 10%, if you're in retirement and you're taking money out, you take the money out of the winner. And so you're rebalancing by taking out things that have done well. So that is Asset Allocation Part 2, Bonds.
how do we justify, as it were, faith that science will give us the truth? It works. Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute.
It's an inductive argument.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Going to do a short little investing skeptically segment on investment clarity. Apparently, this is a phrase or a word, clarity, that I've started using recently, and some people were like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And I guess I must have called it something else before, or I didn't think of a clever way of saying it, and now I've stumbled across something which is a really nice bonus to me for having this show, because sometimes talking out loud, I just come up with things that make more sense or less sense, and I get to go over them again. And it's also weird sometimes when I'm just having conversations and I go, oh, I should make a segment on that. I should make a segment on that. There's always a million things I could make a segment on. But anyway, focus, Phil. This is investment clarity. So I was talking to someone about mutual funds and bond and or stock mutual funds, and they had a handful of stock mutual funds. And every single one of their stock funds, and this is something I have specifically talked about before, had Amazon, had Netflix, had Microsoft, had Facebook. And so even though they had 5 mutual funds with 5 very different names, all 5 of the mutual funds were basically in the same stuff. So they thought their stock investments were very diversified by these 5 different types of funds, because they had growth, investment, growth, aggressive growth, moderate growth, income and dividend, but they were all investing in the same stuff. So one of the things I like to do, especially with the United States part, is I break it up into 6 different segments, which we've talked about before. And to the best of my knowledge, those 6 different segments as Vanguard index funds, and now I think one can do it with Fidelity index funds, but I don't know for sure if this is the case with Fidelity. But at Vanguard, there's no overlap. Absolutely no overlap. So if one of those funds owns Microsoft, cool, you own some incredibly small segment of Microsoft, but the other funds don't. Because from time to time, you get material, if not significant, variation between those different funds. And if all of your stock funds have the same kind of stuff, you don't get this effect. If all of your bond funds are kind of fucking around buying whatever bonds they think are a deal that day, or flipping or switching or tactical investing, whatever, you don't really know what you own. You don't have any kind of clarity on what you own. So that's what I like investment clarity. And I think that's something that's worth significant money to you, and something you should achieve to do, or something that is a benefit of an advisor can provide if they do something like this. So, for example, in the U.S. stock market, in the 12 months ending June 30th, because I don't want to give you numbers every day or every week. Usually it's annual, or maybe at the end of the most recent quarter, which is what I'm doing in this case, June 30th of 2019. The performance between the different segments of the U.S. stock market were materially different. As an example, the small cap value fund had a 12-month return of minus 1.56, but the mid cap growth fund had a 12-month performance of positive 12.05, but 12%. So the difference is 13.5%. That's quite a big spread in just 12 months. So if you're doing an investment portfolio that includes something like this, you can see that distinction of those funds, that all of those funds, those 6 segments that I use in the U.S. stock market, I do expect to make about 10% in the long run. What's the long run? 10, 15, 20 years. Matter of fact, if you look at the 10-year performance for all of these funds, the difference is 1.5% per year. And the further out you go, the smaller that difference becomes in the past. And I'm under the conclusion, the impression, the conviction that that will happen in the future. So when you get a short-term variation, and some people mean days or weeks or months for short-term, but I mean 1 or 3 year variation, that short-term change makes those things that have done poorly more exciting to me. So what do you do with that? Well, if you are younger and you're adding material amounts of money to your portfolio, well, you can just simply focus on adding to the small cap value position to bring it in line with what your model had proposed or suggested before. So you should have an investment model, a plan, I guess, and you follow that plan. And the nice thing about that is it takes out a lot of the guessing, the what ifs, I think I should do this now. I think I should do that now. So if you have a solid plan, maybe you miss an opportunity here and there, but on the whole, you're doing much smarter investing. You're investing based on long-term historical norms, and you have a strategy and a plan, and you're not distracted by the bullshit. Because often great investment ideas, which turn out to actually be great, you're kind of late in the process of finding out they're great, and everyone else has already run up the price of the investment. So this is a way where, in this case, you could add to the small cap value position if you're adding money. And a fascinating thing, we've covered this specifically before. If you are younger, if you are adding money, one of the best things that could happen to you is for everything to go down for a while anyway. Because when you're adding money, you're actually buying more shares of everything. It's the best thing ever for you if you're 20 or 30, maybe even in your early 40s. If you're getting a little later on in years, that can seem kind of scary, which is why you start adding some bonds, the cushion. But in this case, you could add to small cap value. Now, if you've been adding money for a while and you've got a pretty sizey portfolio, you may not be able to add enough money to rebalance that particular position. So you might sell something that's done really well and you add it to something that's not done really well. An example in bonds. For the last couple of years, bonds have been making really good, safe, conservative bonds, 2 or 3% per year. Well, in the last 12 months, interest rates have gone down, and there's concern that the Fed is going to go even lower. So bonds respond in a particular way to that. And as an example, here's the short-term corporate bond fund from Vanguard went up 5.5% in the last 12 months. Now, its yield is 2.5%, but it went up 5.5%. So it went up even more than what you're expected to make in the fund from the yield because people are more interested in buying that bond fund. And we go down to emerging market bond fund, which is almost always a very small part of any portfolio, but it made 11%. The Vanguard high yield, also known as junk bonds, made 9%. Now, if you have a junk bond portfolio somewhere else and they were investing in even riskier bonds than Vanguard did, you might have made more than 9%. That's not something I use because I'm not particularly that interested in taking a lot of risk with my bonds. I do that with my stocks. But here's a position where if you're in retirement, you could look at that and say, wow, emerging markets and junk bonds made 9%. That's a great place for me to take out some of my profits. And also you could look at that mid-cap growth that we talked about a few minutes ago that made 12%. Well, let's take some money out there. And it also turns out that the REIT fund made 12%. Let's take out some money there. However, the real dog in all of this is international. And the International Small Cap Fund, minus 6%. The General International is plus 0.6. So those have done terrible, and that's where I would want to add money. If you're in the adding money phase or if you're rebalancing. And so you have this clarity where you can see certain specific things have done well, certain specific things have not done well. You can look at your original plan, you can balance to your plan, you can adjust to your plan. You don't want to do this all the time. Once a year probably will do it. If you're adding significant money, or if you're taking out, hopefully not too significant money, once a quarter maybe, you can look at it, and maybe you look at it and you say, it didn't change that much. My percentages aren't off that much. And you leave it alone. If you're off a couple percentage points, you could still leave it alone. If you're off a whole bunch, well, then now you make an adjustment. If it's in a tax deferred, tax qualified, or tax privileged account, IRA, Roth IRA, 401k, it's very easy to make those changes. If it's in a taxable account, you got to look at what the tax consequences might be. You might want to run that by your advisor or your qualified tax professional and see that. But all of this becomes available to you as an option, as a way to theoretically at least boost your long-term performance, only if you have investment clarity. If you have 4 or 5 bond funds that are just bond funds, you don't know what they're doing. You don't know what they own. You don't know what they sell. You don't know what they're going to own 6 months from now. You can't do any of this. You just kind of have to muddle along, and maybe you could look at the difference between bond fund and stock fund to decide what to do or what to adjust. And of course, you can even have the situation where you have a bond fund that has a whole bunch of stocks in it, or you can have a stock fund that has a bunch of bonds in it. You can have funds that are like mixed, or funds that like some tactical funds will change. It'll be international one week, domestic another week, bonds another week. It does all kinds of weird things, shorts, longs, straddles, spreads, all kinds of weird stuff. I have no idea what's going on inside of that fund. I don't know what to do with it. So I really like this idea of investment clarity. So you can see down to the dollar what type of investments you own, what types of risks you are taking. And it doesn't mean you're always going to win, and it doesn't always mean they're going to act the way that you expected. But at least you have a fighting chance to see what you've got, understand what you own, and see very easily what you might need to adjust. So that's a little bit about investment clarity. The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investments should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship. All right, everybody. With me now, I have Matt Dillahunty. How are you, sir?
Oh, not too bad. How about yourself?
I am doing well. And before we start this performance, I want to make sure that everybody knows. Have we ever met before?
Yes, in fact, we have.
Okay. Have we planned anything out at all about what we're going to talk about today?
I think it would be a stretch to say that would be true.
Okay. So you genuinely have no idea what questions I'm going to ask, and you're going to give your honest to best opinion and answers to the questions as they come. Is that correct?
Yeah, except I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, I was kind of setting it up like a magic show, when you call someone up on stage. So my first question that you're not expecting, who killed Jeffrey Epstein?
Oh, I have no idea. But I'm willing to accept that somebody who was incredibly rich and was locked up and who had previously attempted suicide and was facing terrible charges might actually kill themselves.
Yeah, I could see that the future conditions of his life might be perceived as suboptimal. Yeah,
I think if you've been a spoiled little shit for all those years and then all of a sudden everything's going to be taken away. But the bigger thing is, if I looked at it, it wasn't so much frustrating that there were people who had doubts. Of course, if there's somebody, that we're expecting big stories from, kills themselves. Well, how do you know it wasn't the man who, or whoever? So I understand why people might have suspicions like that, but the people who are just flat out asserting, oh, no, he didn't kill himself, this was an inside job or a conspiracy from blah, blah, blah. And I'm just, you don't have the evidence to justify the position you're taking.
And that's the greater point. Hopefully my listeners, and I know you picked it up, but I said a few hours after it became public that Jeffrey Epstein's death was basically a conspiracy Rorschach test, because everybody could see what they wanted, and people who I considered longtime friends and social media contacts, skeptical people even, lost their fucking minds.
Yeah.
I think there was a great loss of skepticism. So I guess if I can sum up, you're basically saying you don't actually know, but it doesn't surprise you that he might have killed himself. And it probably wouldn't surprise you at some point if real evidence comes forward that someone else assisted him in some way.
Yeah, right now it's like when you look at it, I got a call on the day that it happened from somebody who had actually been an inmate within the New York penitentiary system. And they're like, because at the outset, people were saying, oh, well, he was on suicide watch. No, he wasn't. He had previously been on suicide watch. And I find it rather unremarkable that somebody attempts to kill themselves, gets put on suicide watch, doesn't kill themselves while they're on suicide watch, then after the suicide watch is over, kills themselves. I mean,
yeah.
What am I missing here? Oh, he's really, really rich. Well, that's interesting. So are a lot of other people. Oh, well, he's got information on so many people who could be. Yes, it's unfortunate. And perhaps in a last bit of let me save some of my friends, it's, you're never going to get me, coppers, or who knows? We should stop. I think the one thing that I find myself cautioning people on the most is to stop pretending that you can read somebody else's mind. I watched this happen, and it's happening in the skeptic community, in the atheist community, and in every community, and in almost every small relationship that I've ever witnessed. I had friends who were dating, and when it didn't work out, all of a sudden they're replaying the entire relationship in their head and making assumptions about what was going on in the other person's head, and then deciding that person never really cared about them or they were terrible. We see it in the this stuff related to atheist community of Austin. Evidently I'm just I've seen people say that there was a masterminded conspiracy, or that so-and-so is terrible and so-and-so is terrible, or things are falling apart. And the truth is everything's pretty much fine.
Yeah. And I think people should move forward with just a little bit of charity in their heart and in their mind when evaluating the actions or the perceived actions of another person, because you don't really know their intent. And I know a lot of people, current members and some former members of the ACA, Atheist Community of Austin, and I know that each and every one of them, at least to the best of my understanding, would have the best interest of everybody involved, but sometimes people disagree.
Yeah.
And
that's been an interesting thing, is to watch people who have known each other for a decade or more. And I'm not just talking about, ACA stuff. I'm saying I see this all the time, where it reminds me, everybody is kind of guilty of putting on a face. Some of us are more conflict avoidee than others. You start dating, you put on your good clothes and your best face, and you go out and you're far more charitable in your listening and in your interactions in those early stages, and when you genuinely care about somebody. And then when that line gets crossed, when there's a real or perceived point of sincere disagreement, not only does that charitable listening go away, but there seems to be a kind of like a sci-fi retcon thing going on, where people play back the entire history of interactions and go, if I'd have paid attention here, I would have seen this, seen that, or this is it. And that is exactly conspiracy theorist thinking. It is, conspiracy theories are when you take a bunch of disparate facts and weave together a compelling story that on the surface at least seems plausible. And if we I've been shocked personally by the number of people who seem to consistently be doing that about a variety of subjects in the last few months or years, especially. But maybe I was just not paying enough attention, Right?
and now you're reviewing your past experiences to look for clues.
Yeah, except I'm kind of not. I don't have that much time to focus on the past. It's like, hey, let's move on to the next thing. We're either going to agree or we're not.
Yep. Speaking of next things, another random topic that you have no preparation for. I was recently told that I could not call someone a racist because I'm white. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that you can call someone a racist if you want to, no matter what your skin color is, just as a matter of freedom of speech. But what I think they're talking about is whether or not you, being in a privileged position, are able to make a determination about racism that is going to be reasonably accepted by those who are marginalized. And so that becomes kind of circular. It's like only the people who are in this little group here can make this determination. And my biggest problem with it is that it really tends to alienate allies. Yeah. So like if it's not that and I don't think they're saying that. I think there's a lot of shorthand that goes on, and there's a lot of hyperbole and exaggerating for the sake of making the point. It's like, oh yeah, well, your opinion on this doesn't count. But what it really kind of means is it's okay if you agree with me, and of course you can make up your own mind about things. But at the end of the day, this group's view on something is, we're going to say it takes priority, and in some cases it may. Right. I've debated abortion. I mean, this Sunday night, I'm actually doing a debate. How do we resolve the conflict between religious liberties and LGBT rights? Now, I was first offered this debate. I mean, this is with the Bible and Beer Consortium out of Dallas, but we're doing it in Austin here on campus at like the AT&T Amphitheater. They want it to be their big first kind of Austin division of the Bible and Beer Consortium, which is, Ezra's been a friend of mine for years now, and the debates have been really good for all of us, and I like working with them. Austin is not as a town, is not as easy to get those sorts of venues as Dallas is. But when we first talked about this, it was probably back in, I want to say February, March timeframe, I think. I'd have to go back and look, but I almost opted out, because in much the same way that when I debated abortion, I had concerns about the optics of a male, a cis male, sitting there on stage defending a right to choose, particularly against a woman. Now, granted, we were both atheists, and although one of us was former Catholic, but the optics are important. And when this debate came around, I almost opted out, because I was like, why do you need another someone who's not a part of the LGBT community or not part of those groups defending those rights? And part of it was just to make sure that we got, a decent sized audience. I'm going to draw a bigger crowd than probably anybody else he could get, essentially for free, because I do these as for my channel and as a right favorite Ezra. But the other issue about this was, I think it's actually a good thing on occasion, not all the time. I'm not going up there to claiming to speak on behalf of the LGBT community. I'm going up there to say, hey, this is about the conflict. This is not about rights. We're not having a debate about rights. Sunday night is not going to be what rights should the LGBT community have. They should have the same rights as absolutely everybody else. That's why we specifically frame this debate about how do you resolve this conflict, because whether we like it or not, there are people who feel that their religious privilege is in conflict with somebody else's rights. And for me, the debate's over in 5 seconds, because when your religious liberties come in conflict with somebody else's rights, you fucking lose. That's just it. You can say all day, well, my religion is opposed to this. Well, congratulations. If it's opposed to, gay marriage, don't marry somebody of the same gender.
If it's opposed to shellfish, don't fucking eat shellfish.
Yeah. But it's important because this conflict still exists. And so for me, like with most debates, I don't view this as a way to necessarily resolve the truth or change my opponent's mind. This is about educating the public, because everybody is going to be on one side or the other of this, and is going to run into conversations with people on one side or the other. So finding a way, even though my position is really simple, if your religious liberties come in conflict with someone else's rights, you lose. I know people won't see it that way, and that's why there's still a conflict and why I've agreed to go ahead and do this.
Absolutely. And another topic change here, because I'm trying to keep this paced up so you can get back to your work. You're also one of the hosts on the TV show, The Atheist Experience. And recently, it's become something quite regular where people call up and say they have evidence for something, for Christianity, for God, and then they share a story about something that happened to them, and it involves memories and all this stuff. Can you walk us through the difference between a story and evidence?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's you're right. This does happen all the time. The story is the claim. Hey, I had this experience. I was walking along a road and a bright light came down and time seemed to stop. And the next thing you know, I was on a spaceship and I was orbiting a nebula planet, blah, blah, blah. What if throw your sci-fi in there?
Yeah.
That's the story. Then when you ask for the evidence, you're asking for, okay, what can you present that supports the story? And I'm not just talking about, physical evidence. You can construct an argument that, as long as it's accepted, which would, valid and sound, it would count in favor of your proposition. And so that's why I constantly remind people, if somebody tells me they relate any experience they've had, I believe they've had an experience which they are honestly trying to relay, but that doesn't mean I believe their explanation for it. And so I can't conclude reasonably that somebody was abducted by aliens, but I'm willing to accept the fact that they believe they were, at least until I have evidence that they're probably lying or delusional or whatever.
Yeah, fair enough. So a story that may have happened 20 or 30 years ago doesn't prove aliens. It doesn't prove God. It doesn't prove Jesus or ghosts. It's a story, and maybe, just maybe, your memories are distorted some way or another unintentionally, because we're just humans. And the thing that you posit as the explanation, you haven't provided any support for that other than you just filled a gap in your understanding of reality.
It's I think, probably one of the most difficult things to do, and I'm not sure how successful or how frequently it's successful on the show, is to get to the foundation of what someone is really claiming. Because we play with language, but also we engage in some, like, perhaps unintentional deception and self-deception with language. And so when somebody says, they call in and the call screener will write down, this person claims they have evidence for the existence of God. Cool. And we get them on and they tell an interesting story of what happened to them. And so we'll ask questions of, okay, what are the potential explanations for this? And what makes you think that you've landed on, the right explanation? And when you start poking holes in the model that they've constructed, it's often like almost physically painful to observe the hoops that someone will jump into or jump through in order to justify what they think the best explanation is. And in truth, all most of them are ever really saying is, well, I can't think of anything else that would explain this other than a God. And they haven't spent any time thinking about whether or not that God is actually an explanation, because I would and have argued that it doesn't have any explanatory power. You're attempting to solve a mystery with a bigger mystery. But also, if they were to look at this in an abstract sense, if they were to hear somebody else's claim from a religion that they don't believe, that was fundamentally identical, and listen to that person's reasoning for how they came up with, it's not Yahweh that did it, but it's, Thor or Odin or Beelzebub, or pick somebody, I don't think they would be convinced at all. So there's a there's a level of cognitive dissonance. I mean, we're all going to suffer from cognitive dissonance and Dunning-Kruger and all those nifty philosophical things or psychological things on occasion. But it strikes me as odd when you can come up with two situations that are as directly analogous as you could possibly come up with. And one of them, somebody's like, yep, that's the right answer. And for all the other ones, they're like, no, that's just silly. And it's because we don't think in syllogisms. I did a debate on Tuesday, which is currently being posted now, even though it was live streamed and available elsewhere. The whole thing was he's a proponent of the transcendental argument for the existence of God, and never once presented an entire argument. Certainly nothing with premises and a conclusion in a syllogism. It was just, there's this, and that kind of leads me to that.
Yeah, I understand. And before I get to another topic I want to discuss, I want to make sure that we give you ample time to be shamelessly self-promotional. Tell us about your YouTube channel and Patreon page, because that's how you make your living, right?
Yeah. So patreon.com/atheistdebates is my, I guess I was going to say it is my primary job. It is, I post 4 videos a month, essentially. Some of them are debates. Some of them are reviews of debates. Some of them are me talking about a particular topic or a logical problem or the type of things we're even talking about now, about, if somebody comes up and says they have evidence for that, what the heck does that mean? And what evidence should we accept or not? I've had some really good questions come up about that lately that are outside the bounds of, what I'd normally get, which during the debate Q&A the other day, it was essentially what quality and quantity of evidence should be considered sufficient to believe something. And that's the whole ball of wax right there.
Yeah, and it depends. I'm assuming you're going to agree, but if not, great fun. It depends on the significance of the claim. If I told you that I had a ham sandwich yesterday for lunch, who gives a shit?
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. So yeah, I do that at patreon.com/atheistdebates. Those videos get posted up on my YouTube, but I also travel around doing lectures and debates, conferences, in addition to magic shows. In particular, I've been doing one called Magic and Skepticism that is, I don't know, I can vary the link, but it's probably best at about an hour and 20 minutes or so. It's primarily a lecture that uses magic to demonstrate points about what skepticism is or isn't, when we should or shouldn't accept claims. And I'll be heading to Dragon Con. Not this weekend, but next weekend. Wow, I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
And I'll be down at Dragon Con with Kurt Anderson and Jamie Ian Swiss. We'll be doing a magic show, or I'll be doing a portion of the Magic and Skepticism show, along with sitting on some panels and interacting with as many Comic-Con attendees as I can possibly fit in that weekend.
We're recording right now on August 22nd, and this will probably go up for my patrons, today, and to the public in a day or so. So we're talking about the 29th or something like that, 30th, 31st?
Yeah, August 29th through Monday the 2nd, basically the extended Labor Day weekend.
Okay.
In Atlanta.
Just in case someone listens to this in September, it's over. It's too late.
Yeah, sorry I missed you.
Yeah.
But, I'll be at Free Flow in Florida in November, and then
we're going to have a party there, by the way, because myself and my wife are going to be there, and some other people that we know. So we're going to have a hoot.
Yeah, I'm always looking forward to going back to Free Flow and working with David and Jocelyn and everybody.
Yeah.
I know I'm probably going to the UK in November. An organization there has reached out to me they're having like their 10th anniversary and wanted to get me over. And rather than just doing, flying 10, 11 hours, doing one event one day and then turn around flying 10, 11 hours back, I'm trying to reach out to a few other groups in the UK to see if I can't make it a week thing where I do, an event at Cambridge, an event and, drive all over the UK if I need to make the trip worthwhile. The last time I was in England, I was there for 30 hours. I flew in, I left a conference in Milwaukee, flew 9 hours or so to land in London, went directly to my hotel. And as I went to my hotel, I passed the Natural History Museum and I apologize if I get the names of these wrong, but I think that right next to that is like the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'd always wanted to go to the British Natural History Museum, but the other museum was having a special limited engagement Pink Floyd exhibition. My hotel was literally across the street from this place, but I landed, went to the hotel, took a 4-hour nap, then drove to the venue, and then myself and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins did an event that evening. After it was over, we ate. I went back to the hotel, took a nap, and then had to catch a train to Gatwick to immediately fly back. I was in London for less than 30 hours.
Yeah, and that's rough.
I don't ever do that again.
Yeah, that's not cool. Another thing I want to cover, and it may be painfully redundant to you, but I think you're up to it. Keep it in mind that a large part of my listeners are different. I mean, there's some crossover from the atheist community of Austin and the atheist experience in this show, but there's going to be a lot of people who are different. So I thought it would be important to cover a little something in the Bible. And from time to time, I hear this, and I know you hear it almost weekly, that slavery in the Bible is different than what we think of as slavery in the United States. Can you walk us through that rationale or why it's broken?
Yeah, so I have a video up actually on my channel that goes through almost word for word, almost everything the Bible has to say about slavery and in the broader context. So the longer answer to this is up on my YouTube channel, along with, I don't know, seemingly every other week or so on the Atheist Experience. I remember standing there at a Bible and Bear Consortium event in Dallas, and there were 4 young apologists standing in front of me, and one of them wanted to challenge me on what I'd said about slavery. And it was the most eye-opening thing ever to have each of them give a different proposed justification for the Bible's view on slavery. And that made it really easy for me because I just looked at them and said, okay, you guys sort out what the correct answer is, and that's the one I'll address, because I'm not going to address 4 different apologetics positions. So you guys are all Christians. You guys all, are advocates for the Bible. You think I'm wrong about slavery. So get together and come up on the one answer that you guys agree on, and I'll address that. And I never heard from them again.
Yeah, you're not gonna.
Because there were some that were saying, oh, well, slavery in the Bible is different from slavery as we think of it. It wasn't chattel slavery like we had in the U.S. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I care about the varieties of different types of slavery. I was only reading what the Bible actually said, which is that you should buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you. There are different sets of rules for Jewish slaves than there are for non-Jewish slaves. There's different rules about letting them go. And at the end of the day, the Bible on more than one occasion specifically lists slaves as your money, your property that you can pass on to your children, and that it's okay to beat them as long as they don't die within a couple days. To me, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about, slavery, in the way that it was practiced in the United States, slavery as it's been existed around the world. If your view is that another person gives up their freedom or has their freedom taken from them, and they are now your property to do with as you want, and the limitations are such that they're no longer treated as an equal person. Like in the Bible, it's an eye for an eye, but not if it's a slave's eye. And I'm opposed to eye for an eye. I think that's perhaps not the best way to go about justice. I understand that in a naive sense, this is, appealing, and certainly was appealing to our ancestors.
Right.
But the point is that there are different set of rules for slaves, because slaves aren't people. They are property. They don't have the same rights that everybody else has. They don't have the same liberties that everybody else has. And I've heard people say, well, it's kind of like, prison. Prison is slavery. Well, in case where we're imprisoning people, it's because they have done something that has caused harm to society, and then either are in need of rehabilitation, which, okay, we can have a second debate.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
If that actually happens.
Yeah.
Or we need to protect them from themselves or society from them, and that limits our options. What are you going to do? If you looked at it from a simple standpoint of, we're a village of 20 people, and somebody contracts some disease that makes them a raving, dangerous person, what do you do with them? Well, in many cases, you might restrain them, but they're still not slaves. The motivation behind this and their rights are different. And so we have prisoners, even in modern society, who are fundamentally have rights that a slave would not have. The right to representation, the right to submit, an appeal, that they have to be treated humanely, that we're not going to engage in any sort of cruel and unusual punishment, even though I would argue that perhaps we do. So when the people say, oh, well, slavery in the Bible isn't what you think it is, my answer is stop pretending you know what I think it is, because I'm reading the damn book. And you can complain all day I'm not taking it, or I'm taking it out of context. I'm the one that's actually reading the full context, which is why there's a 30-minute video on my channel that goes through, every aspect of slavery.
And what's that channel called again?
Oh, it's patreon.com/atheist debates, but on YouTube it's crap. YouTube.com/Matt Dillahunty, I guess.
Okay. I want to make sure everybody gets there.
How terrible is it that I can't even remember the link to 120,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I can't remember the short link to my
I'm going to check myself.
My actual content. But so anyway, yeah, the one common response that I get is that the Bible's not talking about slavery; it's talking about indentured servitude.
Yeah,
and in some cases, it is. But we've learned since then that debtors' prisons.
Sorry.
Aren't a moral thing.
Yeah.
And indentured servitude, it's patently absurd to suggest that thousands of years ago, indentured servitude was significantly different from what we view as slavery. If, where's the guarantee of their rights in the courts, and how do you make sure that somebody's, being treated fairly and being compensated fairly? And the other thing is that even when the Bible lists slavery, in the context of indentured servitude, it's like the same amount of time for everything. You want a plot of land, 7 years. You want 2 plots of land, 7 years. You want 93 plots of land, 7 years. I mean, this is just so oversimplified that it's absurd to suggest that there's anything moral or just about this. But when it specifically says, buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you, they're your property, you can pass them on to your kids.
You can beat them.
Yeah, you can beat them as long as they don't die with it. There's special rules, and there's different set of rules for Jewish slaves than non-Jewish slaves. I mean, this is all Exodus 21, and I think Leviticus 25, and I'm not remembering exactly where in Deuteronomy.
That's all right. They just go to your video and they'll get it all.
Yep.
Video channel, at least one of the names you use is Atheist Debates, but if you just go to YouTube and search it there for Matt Dillahunty, Dillahunty, you'll find it. Another thing that you have done, and I've done this a few times myself to great effect, when you're debating with someone about slavery in the Bible, you ask them if they would be willing to volunteer to be your slave under the terms and conditions of the Bible.
Yep.
And boy, do they spin around and argue out of it, and it's just a fun thing to watch.
Yeah, it's a couple weeks ago I asked a woman that, and she said yes, she would, and she's not the first. It happens from time to time that somebody will say yes, and I think it's because they're
stuck.
They really don't have any other option. If they're going to argue that it's not a bad thing or an immoral thing, then when you ask, okay, would you be my slave under the rules of Exodus 21? If they say no, then they're admitting that there's something that they wouldn't admit. So some of them will actually say yes. And I know that one of the biggest reasons they're okay with saying yes is they know it will never happen. So it is in a way a lie, even if they, aren't necessarily aware of it right away.
Yeah. One of my go-tos is the story of Abraham and Isaac. And if the person has children, I ask them if they heard a voice in their head and they were convinced it was God, Would they kill their own child? And thankfully, most people have struggles with that. But when someone immediately, spontaneously responds, yes, I would, I know that they are a problem and I should get away from them as fast as I can, because if they're willing to kill their own child because of a voice in their head, what chance do I have?
Yeah, I tend to think, and this is just me generally thinking, people are generally good.
Yeah, indeed.
And that it's far more likely that someone is going to misrepresent their actual position in order to try to save face, or better yet, save face for their religion or their holy book or whatever, than that they would actually do something as terrible as that.
Yeah. And I know we're kind of running out of the time that you promised you would provide me, so I thank you very much for that. Is there any contact information you want to share, any videos you want to promote, something else that you're doing, places that you're going that we haven't covered yet?
Oh.
The
Atheist Community of Austin's Bat Cruise is September 21st here in Austin, and I'm happy, obviously, well, I say obviously, there's tons of people who have no idea what's been going on. I'm president of the Atheist Community of Austin again. We are like a month out, less than a month out. We are 30 days out from our annual bat cruise. Austin has the largest metropolitan bat population in the world. There's about 1 million bats that live under the Congress Street Bridge, and you can take boats out. We get boats that hold 150, 200 people or so, and we get a guest speaker. And this year, Dave Warnock came down. Dave Warnock is currently dying of ALS, and he's doing a project that he's calling Dying Out Loud. And if you haven't already had him on, I'd recommend getting him on to talk about this, because he's, there's lots of issues that we deal with, particularly for people who are finding their way out of religion. And, what do I do now? And what's life like? And, how do I deal with the potential loss of friends and family members? And what do I know about an afterlife and grief and death and dying and all these things? And Dave's facing it head on and advocating for, basic humanist principles. And he's doing it with dignity and compassion. We had him on the shows a couple weeks ago, and I enjoyed it so much and was so impressed that I immediately asked him to come back for the Bat Cruise. And so on that day, we're going to have a lecture or discussion with Dave, along with a quick gathering, and then we'll head out and jump on the boat, and it's going to be, food and drinks and visiting, like it always is.
And if I'm correct, before the cruise is open to the public, but to be on the cruise, you have to have a ticket.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And you can go to atheist-community.org. Our website's currently in the process of being completely revamped, but there is a link available on the main page, atheist-community.org, where you can click to buy tickets for the Bat Cruise. I think we're
close to full.
Well, I don't know. So I don't know how full we are, because I haven't looked in a couple of days.
So go to the website and find out. The listeners can go look, because I'm assuming when it's full, it'll say full.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far. That it's one of the things I'm trying to monitor, so that if we get to the point where the boat is full or close to full, I'm going to shut down tickets. And I think I'm probably going to shut down tickets with about 20 to 25 spots left, just so somebody shows up on the day of. We don't want to overfill the boat, but also somebody shows up and they have a ticket and they managed to get a friend to come with them. And I want to make sure those people get on the boat. And at the end of the day, if we get down to the point where there's, one more person that wants to go than what we have space for, they can have my seat. I'll wait at the pier and talk to people before and after. I've been out on the boat before.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. And of course, you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on YouTube. If anyone has questions, how can they contact you to debate you if you had free time?
If I had free time. Yeah, you can If you have questions about the ACA at all, the Atheist Community of Austin, and those shows, there's several email addresses. TV@atheist-community.org goes to everybody who's involved with the TV shows. You can reach me at president@atheist-community.org. You can, just say a quick Google of my name. MattDillahunty.com is currently not being updated, so I don't tend to point people there. But yeah, president@atheist-community.org. My primary email address, which everybody already has, is sans.deity@gmail.com. sans.deity@gmail.com.
Very good. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Anytime.
I like how you call homosexuality an abomination.
I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President. The Bible does.
Yes, it does. Leviticus
18:22.
chapter and verse. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions while I had you here. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery, as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. She's a Georgetown sophomore, speaks fluent Italian, always cleared the table when it was her turn. What would a good price for her be? While thinking about that, can I ask another? My chief of staff, Leo McGarry, insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly says he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or is it okay to call the police? Here's one that's really important, because we've got a lot of sports fans in this town. Touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean, Leviticus 11:7. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins still play football? Can Notre Dame? Can West Point? Does the whole town really have to be together to stone my brother John for planting different crops side by side? Can I burn my mother in a small family gathering for wearing garments made from two different threads? Think about those questions, would you? One last thing. While you may be mistaking this for your monthly meeting of the Ignorant Tight-Ass Club, in this building when the president stands, nobody sits.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Well, I'm delighted you've made it this far. Again, a nice, long episode. If you appreciate the show, you appreciate the work, you can go leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. You can go leave a 5-star review on Stitcher. Yes, that's right, Stitcher. You can also go to patreon.com and become a patron. A couple extra dollars is not going to kill you. And it shows a little bit of appreciation that you like the content and you get something meaningful out of the show, whether it is the atheism, secularism, free thinking stuff, or maybe it's the investment stuff. Maybe you've done a little bit better for yourself and you just want to show me a little love. Patreon.com/Phil. Couldn't make it much shorter than that. Go there and you can contribute a couple of bucks per show. Keeping in mind that at this rate, it's going to cost you very little because I'm doing a show about every 10 to 12 days. So I'll try to get faster, but coming up, I've got a bunch of things. We've got Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference coming up. I've got CSICon put on by the Center for Inquiry that is in Las Vegas. We've talked about that, and I'll talk about that some other shows, maybe if they're a little shorter. I'm going to, I think it's called Free Flow in Florida in November. I'm also going to go to Italy for 2 weeks in September. Got a lot going on, so there's going to be some more weeks that you're just not going to get a show, or maybe I do another best of show, which patrons don't pay for. It's just bonus stuff, bringing back some of the best over the years. One thing I did want to cover really quickly, I've had talks with people, concerned about the market volatility. I'm concerned about that too, but only to a point because I'm due long-term 5, 10, 20-year investing, and I notice the market fluctuations. I'm not completely blind to it, but I don't really think about it a whole lot. And thankfully, the vast majority of my clients haven't said anything about it. And in part because I'm hoping they feel comfortable enough to not worry about it, not to focus on it, because they have a well-designed portfolio. So if you have a portfolio, and if you're 20 or 30 years old, the best thing that could happen to you is the market takes a shit. Seriously, I've done segments on this. If you're 25 years old and the market goes down by 50% and stays there for 10 years, you keep slamming money in on sale, and then it goes up with all of your investments. You're going to make way more money than if the market marches forward 10% per year for the next 10 years. So if you're a beginning investor, could be a fantastic thing, assuming the economy is solid and you get to keep a job or have a job. But as far as the stock market's concerned, could be the best thing for you. If you are close to retirement or in retirement, you should have an appropriate amount of money in the cushion. You should have an appropriate amount of money in conservative, safe bonds so that if the stock market goes down, your bonds don't go down also. That's one thing that I have seen a lot of people have longer term bonds and or riskier bonds in their portfolio than maybe they should, or a greater percentage. That may not protect you as much as you think when the market goes down. Anyway, I'm diverging. The point that I wanted to make with this is that we as humans, and again, many people have seen things this way, that you get your statements, and month after month, quarter after quarter, generally, with a few exceptions, your portfolio gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We tend to look at that number, and as soon as we have a smaller number than the previous number, we feel like we've just lost a ton of money. And for that short time period, you did. But you have to remember all the months and the quarters and the years that you've made a lot of money. And so I'm looking at the CNN business website right now, and I pulled up year-to-date performance of the S&P 500. Just for reference, as of right now, it's up 15.5% year-to-date. That is for the calendar year of 2019. Yes, of course, the market did fall about 15% in the fourth quarter, but just depending on how you look at it, we're up 15.5% year-to-date. If the market loses 15%, you're about even to where you were on January 1st. So that means for 8, 9, 10 months, you made next to nothing. If you're a long-term investor, 8, 9, 10 months is nothing. It went up 15. If it goes down 15, it could be scary. It could be unsettling because you're going to look at your June statement, or you're going to look at your July 31st statement, or your August 31st statement, I guess. And then all of a sudden you have less money. That's okay. Even if it falls close to 15%, you're even to where you were a year ago. And the nice thing about this little tool on the CNN business page, I'm going to click on this little 5-year thing. In 5 years, the S&P 500 is up 45%. Now, of course, if you lose 45%, you're behind. But if you lose 20, 30, 35%, you might be about where you were with your stock investments 5 years ago. Again, if you're a long-term investor, that's heartbreaking. And if it was permanently lost that money and it never came back, okay, it kind of sucks, but you'd only be back to where you were 5 years ago. You need to have this historical perspective. And then I'm going to go back to 10 years. And for this, I'm going to go to the Wikipedia page S&P 500, because it has this cute little thing where if you invested money at some point, how much would it be worth? And so I'm looking at the end of 2008. And yes, I'm looking because that was the end of the last big drop. But if you had $34.09 invested then, it would be worth $117 at the end of 2018. And that's, of course, before the extra 15%. So it'd be worth like $130, $135 today, which means theoretically you could lose 60, 70, 80% of your money. I'm just kind of guessing off the top of my head, and be set back all the way to where you were 10 years ago. Now, if you've added money in the meantime, it's grown, it's paid dividends. Maybe if you're in retirement, you've taken money out of stocks. But the point is, don't just look at last month or last quarter. Think about how much money you've made in the long run. Now, if you're investing and over the last 10 years, you've been averaging 3 or 4% returns, not the average. Let's see, what is the average here for the last 10 years in the S&P 500? About 13%. So if you've been making 3 or 4%, you have a portfolio problem that you might want to address. because we've made a lot of money. So sometimes you make a lot of money, sometimes it goes down. I've had a few people ask me, what will I do to protect them if the market falls 50%? I ain't going to do shit. Okay, just really clear up front. I am not going to do anything, and you are going to ride that bitch into the ground. Okay, I think that's clear. The reason for that is, and it's the same thing I talked about in show 309 just recently about the market inversion. I'm not going to readdress that whole issue. Go back to 309 and listen to it. Is that you don't know when that's going to happen. And even with the market inversion, often as soon as the market inversion occurs, or the bond, not market inversion, the yield inversion, long-term interest rates are lower than short-term interest rates. Many times after the yield inversion occurs, the markets go up for 6 to 12 to even 22 months, and then they go down. And so if you take all your money out right as that indicator, which so far recently for the last 50 years, I guess, has been a pretty reliable predictor or highly correlated with market corrections. The question is, when do you take the money out? Do you take it out as soon as the indicator flags red? Well, sometimes you miss 30, 40% upside. And one time, I think, from memory, go back to listen to 309, the correction after the yield inversion was 5% loss. So whoop-de-doo. I mean, it could be huge. It could be nothing. It could be tomorrow. It could be a year from now. It could be 2 years from now. It could not happen, because if you go back a little farther in time, there have been cases of yield inversions without a big market drop. I don't know the future. What I do know from the past is that you cannot reliably predict what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And since you don't have that information, the best result for the vast majority of people is to have a really good plan and don't panic. If you lose money in the short term, it's going to come back if the market behaves the same way it has every single time in the past. And since I have it in front of me, 2008, the market went down 37. 2009, it went up 26, and then 15. And then a few years later in 2013, 32%. The dot-com thingy in 2000, 2001, 2002. In 2003, the market went up 30%, and then 11, then 5, then 15. Let's see when it was. 1981, the market went down 5% for that calendar year. The next year was up 21, then 22, then 6, then 32%. Most of the time, the market goes up. If it goes down a whole bunch, every single time in the past, it's come back. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. So don't panic. If you don't have a good portfolio design, or if you don't know if you have a good portfolio design, contact me. Phil at PolarisFinancialPlanning.com. Currently, my minimum for new clients is $500,000. But if you have a smaller portfolio, contact me. Don't send it to me, at least not first. Contact me. Send me an email. It has to be an email so I can keep records for regulatory purposes. Send me an email. We'll talk, and then you can send me some documents. I'll take a quick look at it. And if everything is going great, I'll tell you. If you're invested in total crap, I'll tell you. Not everybody wants to hear it, but that's just kind of how my mind works. Anyway, I'm babbling on. I appreciate you being here all this time. This show is probably now close to hour and a half to 2 hours. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, patreon.com/Phil to go kick in a few bucks. iTunes or Stitcher if you'd like to make a 5-star recommendation. And I do hope to see you somewhere out there on the road soon. Until then, ciao.